What's up everyone, it's James Q Quick, and today I'm going to show you how to create this cool step progress bar with vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's go ahead and dive on in. All right, so I'm going to start out in Visual Studio Code here. We're going to need 3 files, an index.html file, an app.js file, and an app.css file. There's actually an extension that I created if you're interested called the Web Boilerplate extension. And what this thing will do is it'll generate all 3 of those files for you in a project that you have open. So I can do my command palette, Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P on Windows, and then create Web Boilerplate. No worries if you don't have that extension or don't use VS Code or don't want that extension. I've basically just got a stubbed out HTML file. So this is the basic boilerplate HTML file for HTML. Then there's an empty JavaScript file and an empty CSS file. So no big deal there. You can just type that out yourself. All right, so inside of the HTML file, just gonna update this name to be a step progress bar. And then we'll go ahead and lay out our content in the HTML first. So I want to put everything inside of a div with a class of container. Now I'm going to use emit snippets, just an easier way to generate code. You don't have to use these snippets, although they are amazing. I would recommend trying them out. You can just kind of type out the entire thing here. So I've got a div with a class of container, but just doing .container will allow me to generate that little snippet, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to have an H1, just a header text, and it's called step progress bar. And then beneath that, I'll have a div with an ID of step progress bar. So again, using these emit snippets here, you can see what this is going to generate, a div with an ID of step progress bar. So I want that. So inside of our step progress bar, we're obviously going to have a step for each one of the steps that the user has to go through. And if we look at the example here, there's 4 steps, step 1, 2, 3, and 4. I guess they're about content or about context, and then step 3 and 4. It doesn't really matter what those are, but probably step 1, 2, 3, 4 would make sense. So that's what we're going to do. So inside of here, we're going to have a div with a class of steps. So just .step. That will generate this one. Now, each one of our steps will look like this. Inside of that, we'll have a p tag with a class of step text. All right. So again, you can just type that out if you're not using snippets. So that'll be step 1. And then we'll have another div with a class of bullet, and then inside of that, it'll have text of 1. So this is what we'll have for each one of our steps. We'll have a wrapper class or a wrapper div with a class of step, and then inside of that, we'll have the text for that step, and then we'll have the bullet as well. Now, I just want to have a section for the main content. So I'm going to have a div with an ID of main, and then inside of that, I'm going to have a p tag, basically just to represent when we switch different steps, we're going to update this content p tag, because this is going to represent basically what the user would see on each individual page. Now, obviously, this would be probably a form that the user is filling out that would change between the different steps. But in this case, we're just going to do just a paragraph tag with a little bit of text in it. So this thing is going to have a paragraph with an ID of content. All right, so there it is. And then I'm going to start off with step number 1. So we'll update this thing dynamically in JavaScript shortly. But for now, it's just going to start with step number 1 because that's obviously where everybody starts. And the last thing we want in the main section is 3 buttons for go to the previous step, to go to the next step, and then to finish whatever the last step is, if that makes sense. So we'll have a button with an ID of previous button. And then inside of there, we'll have the text previous. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and Option and get an arrow down. That'll give me 2 more. So I'll have the previous button, the next button, and this one will say next, and then this one will say finish. Now we'll get to this in a second, but obviously you're not going to be able to press the previous button if you're on step 1. If you're on step 1, you can't go back to step 0 unless you're doing zero-based indexing, which you usually don't with user experience things. So the previous button will be disabled at times. If you're on the last step, you obviously can't go next. So next will be disabled if you're on the last step. And then finish will only be enabled if you're on the last step. So that's a little bit of the logic that we're going to have to add in JavaScript to make this work. So I'm going to save this. One thing I forgot to do is I'm going to open this up with Live Server. Live Server is an extension that you can get for VS Code. It gives you this right-click option, Open with Live Server, and it will open in the browser with a live reloading server, as you might expect. So if I came back and I said step progress bar updated and save it, it's going to refresh this to show updated there, which is pretty sweet. So that's what we're going to do. Let's go into our CSS file and let's add a little bit of just kind of helper stuff. So we're going to need a hidden class. So hidden will be a display of none. We'll talk about that more. We'll also need to go ahead and style the button. So we won't do too much here, but we'll add padding of 5 pixels top and bottom, and then 10 pixels left and right. Add a border of 1 pixel solid black. Obviously, feel free to find some cooler colors than that. We'll add a transition to this. So this will be for a hover property. So 250 milliseconds on the background color, because we'll change the background color when we hover. And then we'll do our hover state. So button hover, and almost always on a button, you want the cursor to be pointer when you hover on it. Oops, pointer. All right, so that just kind of gives the user the insight that like, hey, you can click on this. Background color, again, get more creative with your colors than black, but that's what we got. And then the text color will be white. So we'll see this, see that kind of transition here in a second. And then we also want to have button disabled. So when the button is disabled, which we will do, and then we hover on it, I'm going to make the opacity, make it a little bit opaque. So set the opacity to 0.6 and then say cursor is not allowed. Where is not allowed? There it is. So that'll just kind of put an X on it to show that, hey, you can't click on this thing, which makes sense. Also going to have a utility class called text center. That thing is going to just do a text align center. If I can get this typing right, text align center. And then last thing is the container. So this is the thing, it's pretty standard. You put some padding on either side, you center the content in the middle of the screen, and then you also add, yeah, I guess the padding just to make sure the spacing and stuff looks good. And you might have a max width. So let's set max width at 400 pixels. This is going to keep it pretty small, and that's okay for now. Margin will be 0 top and bottom, and then auto on left and right. That will center the stuff horizontally. All right, then we'll have, we'll change the margin top. So margin top will be 20 pixels. Now you could have, if I wanted to, I could specify, get rid of this margin top by itself, and I could do 20 pixels and then auto and then 0. And this is saying I want 20 on the top, auto on the right, 0 on the bottom, and then auto on the left. So that'll actually accomplish the same thing. And then we'll add a little bit of padding on here. So padding 40 pixels. So let's just see what we got when we do that. Let's come back over and notice that the content is centered. It's actually kind of small. Let me zoom this in for everyone to see. And the buttons have this little hover effect. So when you hover on the buttons, they kind of transition the color. Looks pretty nice. Again, probably choose something other than solid black. And again, notice the stuff is centered. Now we'll get into styling the actual steps. So notice that doesn't look very good just by default. So with CSS, we're going to transition it into something like this. So we'll figure out how to lay that out right now. So let's dive back into the CSS. And like all of this stuff so far is just kind of general stuff. It's not super important. Well, it's just kind of there to make sure it looks decent. Now we're going to get into the actual step progress bar. So let's target the step progress bar. And the first thing we want to do is we want to use display flex. So this is using Flexbox. If you've never used Flexbox, this allows you to align things horizontally or vertically, and you can do different things with it to make them, I don't know, it's a lot easier to align things and put things in certain places than it was before Flexbox or CSS Grid. So what we're going to do is, let's just say the Flexbox will have a width of 300 pixels, margin 0 auto. This will center itself, and then margin bottom is 40 pixels just to separate itself from everything else. So the first thing you know is this is actually looking a little bit closer to what we expected, right? Where we have step 1 and then the bullet point of 1 here, and then they're laid out horizontally. Now we need to add some spacing. The way we can do that is we can put space in between them, and we can do that on the main axis, which by default on Flexbox is the horizontal axis. So to do that, on the main axis, we do justify content and then space between. Now, if, just for a little bit of insight, if you were to use Flexbox going column based instead of horizontal, or vertical instead of horizontal, the main axis would be top to bottom instead of left to right. So by default, the main axis is left to right. And again, that changes if you change the direction of the Flexbox itself. Okay, so let's save that. Now we see them spread out. And the last thing we want to do is, I've got one more thing in here for align items, flex end. I think we'll see this make more sense later on when we get into our circles, but it's just going to make sure all of our stuff is lining up appropriately. So we'll see that more in a second. So the next thing we want to do is I'm going to take my individual step. So step, and then I'm going to do text align center. This will center those pieces of text. So now they line up pretty good. We're getting closer to what we want. So now we need to go in and update the step text and the actual bullet. The bullet will be fun, but let's start with step text. We'll have a little bit of margin bottom here, 10 pixels. And then the color is going to be that green color that we saw. So it's just something I found that I thought looked cool. So it is 28A745. Now, if we look at this, we see that color in there a little bit. Now we need to work on this bullet, which I think will be pretty cool. So to make a circle, and let me target the bullet class. To make a circle in CSS, you basically just want to set the height and width. So height and width 20 pixels, and then set the border radius to 100%. That's going to make a circle. Now you can't tell because we don't have a border on it. So let's set a border on this thing. So border 1 pixel solid, and then that same green color. So 28A745. So now we should see we've got a circle here. All right, so that's looking pretty good there. And then we can add a little bit more to this. So we'll set the color to that same thing. So 28A745. All right, so we've got the color of the text in there as well. The display, oops, not that one. Display is inline block. Position is going to be relative. This way we can do some absolute positioning here in a second. So we'll set that. And then a couple of transition things. We'll do transition on the background color over 500 milliseconds. And if you're not familiar with what this means, it means if we change the background color, it's going to transition from one to another over the course of 500 milliseconds. And then we'll also set the line height to 20 pixels. Okay, so lots of stuff in there. Some of it won't make as much of a difference until a second from now, but you can kind of see this is starting to look the way that we want. So the next thing we want to do is we want to be able to fill in one of those circles when we complete it. So what we can do is we can say, hey, target a div with a class of bullet and a class of completed. And when that happens, we're going to invert it. So the color will be white, and then the background color will be that green color. So 28A745. Okay, so the way we test this, we won't be able to see this right now, but we can test it by adding a complete to step 1 up here in the class. And now we should see completed, I think is not complete, but completed. So add that class. And still not working. Let's see what we're missing. Completed. Make sure the CSS looks right. Completed. Bullet. Dot completed. That looks right. Let me refresh just to make sure. And let's open up the console here to see if it's... Oh, I think completed actually goes on the bullet. Yeah, so not on the step itself, but on the bullet. So that bullet is completed. So there we go. So now we see that filling in there. And obviously, we're going to update this dynamically with JavaScript on these button pushes. So we'll get to that in a second. And the last thing we want to do is once we complete a step, not only does it change the color and kind of fill it in, it's also going to draw this little line over to the next step. And that's actually kind of a fancy thing as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to target bullet.completed again, and then the after effect. So what after does, it allows you to basically in CSS generate some content that will go after whatever that targeted element is. And the content here is going to be empty, so we're not going to have any text in there. It's going to be position absolute. So the reason we marked the step, or the bullet with position relative, is so that when we do position absolute down here, the absolute position is going to be relative to the actual bullet, which is its parent. All right, so then we'll go in and do these. Actually, one thing I want to do first, let's do width, not that one, width of 54 pixels. So I'll make it 54 pixels wide. And the background color will be 28A745, that green color. And then we need a height as well. So height is going to be 14 pixels. So at this point, we should see this line. I think that's not supposed to be 14. It's supposed to just be 1. So 1 pixel instead of 14. And now you can see this line, but we need to push it basically from right here, the edge of 1, up to step 2. And we do that with our absolute positioning. So what we'll do is we'll say the right, it's going to be pushed over to the right 60 pixels. And then the bottom will be 10 pixels. So 10 pixels from the bottom of its parent. And now that's actually exactly, or maybe it's a pixel or 2 off. But basically exactly where we want it. We could push it over 1 more pixel, 61, and that actually looks like it's probably perfect. Yeah, I think that looks good. So we've got that thing, and then we can tell that this is going to continue to work if we add completed to another step. And you can tell that like as we add that class to that element, it's going to progress and kind of show the progress for the user. So now I'm going to get rid of completed on both of these. So we're starting from scratch. And then now we get into the JavaScript, which is going to be kind of fun. So I've got a snippet that you might be interested in using. It's called getID in JavaScript. And what I can do is it can prompt me for what ID I'm selecting for and then name that variable the same thing. All right, so I've got that snippet. If you're interested in using that snippet, you can come to jamesqquick.com/snippets. There's not much here now, but I will add all of the useful snippets that I use so that you can have access to them too. So on here, here's the snippet. You can copy this into your javascript.json snippet file, and you can use the snippet as well. If you don't want to do that, obviously you can just come and type in all of this by using document.getElementById, and then you pass in the name of the ID of that element. All right, but I'm going to do this a couple more times for the next button, and then the finish button, and the content. All right, and then the last one is a little bit different. It's going to be the bullets. I want to select all the bullets, and it's going to be document.query selector all, and I want to get all elements that have a class of bullet. Now, the one thing that is a little bit weird about this, you might expect it to return an array of elements. Actually, what it returns is what's called a node list, and it doesn't have all the functionality of an array. So what we can do is use the spread operator. And what this syntax does, it's ES6 syntax for arrays or JavaScript arrays. What it's going to do is it's going to take every element in here, and then it's going to copy that into an array. So this spread operator, the 3 dots, is going to take every element of whatever comes next and put it into an array. All right, so now I've got an array of those bullets. All right, and then a couple of variables that we need. We need a max steps variable. This is going to be not just a const in terms of this, but it's actually like a constant number that we use to reference. It's going to be 4. And then we'll also say current step equals 1. So we're going to start out on step 1. Notice that I use let here instead of const. That's because we'll need to update the current step as we make progress through the steps. All right, so let's get into the next button. We want to add that functionality. Next button .add event listener. And when we click on that next button, what do we want to happen? So using arrow functions here as the callback, ES6 arrow functions, look those up if you're not familiar with them. But basically what we want to do, let's come back to our progress bar. If we click next, we want to highlight the current step that we're on and then move to the next step. So we want to update this current step variable. Now, a couple other things we'll want to do is if we're on the first step, next step should be our previous step should be disabled from the start. All right, so from the start, we want the previous, where is previous button on here? Previous button should be disabled by default. So we see it's disabled. If we click next and we go to the next step, then we should then enable the previous button. Also, finished button should be disabled from the start. So we shouldn't be able to click finished until the end. All right, so we've got those. So now let's get into doing those actions with the next button. So we want to highlight the current bullet, whatever our current step is. We want to highlight that bullet by adding the completed class. So we can get that bullet by getting our bullets array and then saying current step -1. The reason is we're starting current step here at 1 and it's 0-based indexing. So to get the actual current one in the array, we just subtract 1. and then we call the class list of it, and we add the completed class. Now this is probably a little bit tricky, so let's maybe we could break this out. Let's say current bullet equals this thing, and let's take current bullet and add that class. So just to reiterate, bullets is an array of all of the bullet point elements. We're selecting the current one by using current step -1 because it's zero-based indexing. And then we take that current and we apply a completed class. So if we click this next button, we should see we've added the highlight there. And you may not notice this, but watch the colors really closely. It's got a little bit of a transition, so it's kind of got a pop to it, which I think is pretty cool. All right, we also want to increase current step ++. So we want to increase that thing by 1. We want to then take the previous button and set disabled to false. And the reason is if we've clicked next, the previous button should be enabled so that we can go back to the previous step. And then we can check if current step is equal to max steps. So if we get to the last step, then the next button should be disabled, and the finish button should be enabled like this. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. Let's do one last thing and then we'll walk through this. So we also want to set the inner text of the content. That's the stuff that's supposed to change with each step, and we're just going to set it to step number and then use the new current step. This way it can show the progress as we go through. Now I'm using ES6 template literal strings in here. This allows you to do variable interpolation inside of the string by using the $ and then brackets. And this will do step number and then the value of that variable. So let's save this. Let's come back over. We click next, 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 and then now we're on step 4. So 4 is the last step. We actually want the finish button to be enabled at that point. So did we do this correct? We've got the next button disabling correctly, but the finish button should be enabled. So let's make sure we've got that right. Oh, it looks like we didn't update the name of the finish button. So make sure we have that ID correct. Now let's refresh. Let's go next, next, next. And now the finish button is enabled. And I hope that makes sense as to why, because on step 4, if you're ready to finish step 4, you're not going to the next step. You're actually finishing the form completely. And then previous is enabled, so you can go back to previous steps 3, 2, and 1. Okay, so now let's work on the previous button. So add event listener, and then we'll do a click event, and then have our ES6 arrow function callback. And this is actually going to be fairly similar. What we want to do is let's get the previous button, so const or previous bullet, and that is going to be bullets at current step -2. So -1 will get the current one as we saw up here, and then previous one will be just subtract an extra one from there. And then we want to, if we're going back, we want to take that previous one and we want to mark it as not completed anymore, which means we want to remove the completed class. So we'll take our previous bullet class list dot remove and remove that completed class. Okay. Then we'll update our current step. So current step -, we're just going to subtract 1. We want to enable the next button. So just make sure that if we go back 1, then regardless of what the current one is, after we go back, we should be able to go forward again because we already went back 1. So next button disabled is false. It should be enabled. And then also the finish button disabled should actually be disabled. And the reason is if we've gone back 1, we know we're not at the last one. Okay. And then if the current step is 1, set previous.disabled to true. So if we get back to the first one, we can't go back any further. So update the previous button to be disabled. All right. And the last thing is we'll update the inner text here of content. We'll do that again. Oops, got some weird formatting going on. And it'll actually be just the exact same thing. So let's test this out. Let's start empty, as you can see. And let's do next, 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 and then previous, previous, next, next, previous, previous, previous. Those buttons look like they're working. The only thing we have left is the finish button. So let's do the finish button, add event listener, a click event. Should be getting used to this by now. And then the only thing we're going to do is just to kind of simulate finishing this, we're just going to reload the file or reload the page. So let's do next, 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 and then finish. This should just refresh the page. Probably at that point, you would submit your form data to the server or something like that. In this case, we're just kind of simulating finishing it by reloading the page. So that is what I think is a pretty cool step progress bar using vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I'm curious, one, do you enjoy building things from scratch without using any tools or libraries or anything like that? Have you built a progress bar? Have you built anything similar that you'd like to share? I'd love to see in the comments below stuff you've worked on. Share CodePen links or application links. I'd love to take a look. And in the meantime, thanks for checking out the video, and I will see you in the next one.